Welcome YouTube to another D&D Fridays. It's yours truly, the Geek Live. Today we'll be taking a look at just how to run challenges, combat, stuff like that in a theater of the mind type of setting versus maps and minis. But before we get into all of that, let's not forget to hit that subscribe button down below, that notification bell, and comment on down below on what's y'all's thoughts on that and which way y'all might prefer on how to do that. But without further ado, let's continue on. So there's really, at least in my experience, just really two ways of playing the game. Either theater of the mind, which is basically just your imagination, everything that goes on, you think about where it might be, versus maps and minis, where you actually have some sort of map, whether it's a book of maps or Pathfinder maps or whatever, and some sort of minis or tokens that you use to denote your characters, monsters, NPCs, whatever. And you're actually putting your tokens on the map so you can have a visual representation of where everything is. And I think there's pros and cons to each one, personally. So that, so before we get into the details of what each one is all about, what's your thoughts on the overview of both?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think there's pros and cons to each one. I think it gives you the opportunity to, choose which one best suits the play style of your players. I, I like both of them. From an overall perspective, I don't have um, an issue doing one over the other. Well, we can get into some of the pros and cons as we get a little bit deeper, but I think it allows for that flexibility. I think it allows for ease of um, setup, right? If you're in the DM, you want to go theater of the mind, so you don't have to worry about putting out all the maps and all that kind of stuff. It gives you that ability. So
Okay. Well, let's start a deep dive into them, and let's start with probably my favorite of the two, which is Maps Minis. So, one of the pros in my mind, which is why I like Maps and Minis, is it gives is I'm a very visual person, so it gives me an accurate assessment of where everything is. I know exactly where all of the enemies is. These two enemies are like 30 feet away from Billy Bob here, but they're actually 45 from Mary Jane. So I know exactly who I can have the enemies run up and attack, cast Fireball. I know the range of everything, so I don't have to be constantly asking, um, would I be able to get these two creatures in a lightning bolt range without hitting allies or whatever? I can clearly see it happening, and as other people take their turns, I get that visual representation of things going on, so I can make my changes to my battle tactics on the fly without having to really ask a lot of those questions of where is this in relation to other things.
right.
So I think it makes it tremendously easy on that front.
Yeah, I think that's that's probably the biggest pro of doing using maps and some sort of minis is that very quickly you can see visually how where everything's at, how far away everything is, and you're not having to take the time to wait until your turn to ask what does the situation look like, what does the area look like. You can kind of do those calculations as the other players are taking their turn before it the turn gets back to you.
Mhm. And I think that's tremendous. And I think that helps out the full casters a lot more than your martial fighters and stuff. Because as a caster, you have to worry about the range of your spells, the radius, the blast radius of your spells, things like that. So being able to see them in real time, you can have a much quicker response on your turns. Like, oh, I know that blight would work here, but cone of cone definitely wouldn't work. So I don't have to even worry about asking about cone of cold.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's very useful.
Yeah, I think it makes like I was saying, it makes the planning and the execution a little bit quicker, and and you can do all of those calculations kind of on the fly.
And but on the subject of quicker and easier, I think um, one con to that though is coming from a GM perspective is it does come with a little bit of setup time. So you would have to be able to say, all right, I should I need a minute or two to take out this map, fold it out, put the minis where everything is and whatnot. So it does take a couple of minutes, give or take, depending on what you're trying to set up.
Mhm.
So definitely keep that in mind. And then I think the other one is probably more so for GMs is it is pretty cost intensive as you're gonna have to get out there and buy your own maps or create your own maps if you're into that. Like get the minis, paint them if that's your thing. Um, really do all of these collecting and there's never going to be like a one map to fit all type of thing. You're going to need to get several different maps, like maybe a map for icy terrain, a map for just your town terrain, different minis. So you don't have one mini that represents a fighter and a druid. You need two separate minis for those
Right.
classes.
Right.
So definitely keep that in mind. I think that's a con because everybody's not going to have the same financial constraints.
Yeah, that is one of the cons about having maps and minis is you've got to make that investment. You've got to spend the money to be able to have them available to be able to use. Right? You can't just, to your point, you can't just use the same mini to represent every single type of creature or every type of single character. You've got to have a little bit of variety, and depending on how how much means you actually have, that could be a burden, and that's something that needs to be considered when you're thinking about this. Kind of going off of that, I think I put this in the pro side of the column, or in the pro column, I should say. Um, if you do want to have minis, there's a lot of resources out there that you can go in and invest in and get some really nice, fancy minis and maps and terrains and a lot of things that you can really go all out on and really show what the world looks like. And so it helps drive home the narrative point and what the environment looks like in that narrative at that point in time when you're doing, whether it's shopping or an encounter or whatever it might be. You can really truly set the stage.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Like, for instance, if you happen to have a 3D printer and nobody or know somebody with a 3D printer, that's a way you can create terrain and tokens and stuff like that. Or like Hero Forge is a pretty popular place to go get minis and the like.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of different options. I guess one of the ways that I would probably recommend for those who are a bit more budget constrained is if you have like a spare TV or a monitor or something like that lying around, you could really set up your play area around that TV, hook your computer up to that TV, no problem, and just whether it's like pulling up a picture or roll D20, fantasy grounds, whatever, and just pull up a virtual map or and stuff like that. Place your minis on there, and that could be a lot more effective as there's a lot of free sites out there. Like for instance, get a free account on Roll20, pull up some of their free maps on there, and just say, all right, here are your tokens that I'm bringing over from Roll20, or if you want to bring your own, and we'll do from there. So that's one way of really cutting down costs if you really want to have that maps and minis sort of thing, but you don't have as much financial freedom as other folks.
Yeah, I think being able to exploit technology around what is available out there, like you said, roll 20 or whatever. um, there are a few other tabletop simulators you can use, but it gives you the ability to remove that burden, the cost burden from being able to do a map and mini sort of setup. Um, I think the other point you made is that if you had an extra a spare TV or a spare monitor, I kind of put this in the con column a little bit. Is you still have to have a little bit of equipment. You've got to have a place to be able to put that equipment and be able to have it set up. And sometimes that's a little bit hard to come by depending on the space that you have available. Um, but like you said, if you've got that available, like, you're not going to be able to take your 70-inch off the wall, right? You're going to have something that's reasonably sized. And if you've got a big enough table that it can sit on and you can lay it flat and it can work like that, it does. It works really, really well in that regard. But again, you're moving your opportunity cost from dollars and cents, or if you're so inclined, cryptocurrency to actual physical space, right?
Yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, what we've been saying is there's a lot of different ways, shapes, and forms to really go about doing this of varying cost. Um, and and as a GM, you might not have to be the one to supply it. Let's say you're a GM and you have the final financial strain, but let's say one of your players, Joe, he lets you know, hey man, I have an extra monitor or something lying around. Maybe he can bring it over, or y'all can have session over there or something like that. So there's definitely a lot of other options as well. And sometimes the best way of going about it is just asking your players, hey, what type of resources do y'all might have to help out with that?
Yep. Yep. You can definitely make it a group thing and help support each other and have a communal set of tools that can be used by everybody.
Yeah. And, and also another thing to look out for is maybe your local game store or whatever that you're in contact with, they might have an extra setup that you might be able to use if you put in a early enough request on like a Saturday or whatever.
Yep. Absolutely. That's a really good suggestion.
Yeah. So all in all, I definitely say Maps Minis are a great tool to have. If you don't happen to have the budget constraints for it, maybe look into some of the alternatives, talking to other people, so on and so forth. That might be helpful to really use some of this stuff without having to dig too deep into your wallet.
Yep. 100%.
On the flip side of the coin, though, we have theater of the mind. So what theater of the mind is that's really just describing what's going on in the situation, area, whatever, and you and your players are thinking about what's going on. So in a nutshell, think of it like this: you're reading a book. Let's say you're reading the Hunger Games, and you're going through the 75th annual Hunger Games, and the book is describing exactly what's going into it on. Now you're thinking about it. You're putting yourself in there, like, oh, so she's going to do this, that, and the other in the forest. Let me think about what that might look like in my head. That's basically theater of the mind.
It lets it allows your imagination to fill in the gaps that the DM can't necessarily or won't necessarily describe, and you don't have that picture in front of you. So your imagination can run a little bit wild and then fill in those gaps.
Yeah. The pro of theater of the mind is kind of like the con for maps and minis in terms of it's free.
Yep.
Your imagination is free. Granted, there's little bit of a caveat to that. Everybody doesn't have the same level of imagination, but there's nothing anybody could do about that. But it's free, so
Yep.
that's definitely a good thing about that. And then one of the cons to it is it is a bit it's going to be a lot more time consuming in terms of more so combat, I would say, because especially if you have a lot of full casters that love to do like battlefield control and stuff like that, they're going to be asking you quite a bit. Hey, how big is this room? How tall is this room? How far away is these enemies? Can I get to this enemy with 30 feet of movement? A lot of those questions are going to be coming up. So you have to really be prepared for that type of stuff and expect your combats to run the appropriate length of time with those questions and the like.
Yeah, like we were mentioning before, right? There's a lot more question and answer that has to happen during an encounter, right? If you're just kind of describing how the scene is unfolding and with where the creatures and the players are, sometimes even when a player says I move 10 feet this way or 10 feet that way, or I move close to the enemy, you know, without that visual cue, you might not remember it 2 turns later when it's your turn, right? You might have to ask that question. So yeah, it's going to be a lot more of a question and answer sort of scenario with um, theater of the mind.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is a pro for Theater of the Mind, though, is it really offers up a lot more to that playing sort of thing, as you're given a lot more freeway and time and whatnot to really describe what's going on and the like, kind of like a novel.
Mm.
So if you and your grouper is into that type of stuff, then it really leans heavily into that.
Yeah. Um, I, I think one of the cons that I would associate with this a little bit is I think it adds a little bit more burden on the DM to be able to facilitate the narrative mental model that he's trying to portray. He's got to, depending on the scenario, he's got to go into certain details that they might not necessarily go into when you've got physical models, right? If you can plop out a nice little mini or map that shows the terrain, you don't necessarily have to sit there and describe it all, right? I, I put that sort of on the border between a pro and a con with Theater of the Mind because um, sometimes, like we mentioned, you can let the people's imagination run wild and fill in those gaps. But sometimes, depending on the complexity of the situation, right? If you're in a 300 square foot room or whatever, okay, not you don't have to describe it more than saying it's 300 square feet, right? 100 feet to the roof, 100 feet this way and 100 feet that way, whatever. But if you're in like a little tight little area and you've got a lot of nooks and crannies and twists and turns, you got to take that time a little bit more to describe the scenario so that your players know kind of what's coming up in front of them and know how they can maneuver within that space.
Yeah, I agree. And I personally think that a good campaign or a good really marries both of them together, both the theater of the mind and the maps and minis, because I think there's a good time and place for everything. Just taking a look at combat, for example, I think if you have a very strategic battle coming up with like the final boss, or you have some sort of like war scene or whatever, I think maps and minis go great in that sort of thing. But if you know you're setting up this sort of battle with just a couple of minions, that might be like a trivial battle or easy battle or something like that. I think using Theater of the Mind is the way to go, as you know, it's going to be a pretty easy battle for the players to really overcome and be victorious. Eh, might as well not you. Might as well not take the time to have to set up and whatnot for maps and minis. Just get straight to the action. You know it's going to be over in like 2 rounds anyways.
Yeah.
So really just gauging that.
Yeah, I think in general both of them fit really well into a normal campaign, and for those smaller type of scenarios, it's probably better to do Theater of the Mind. And when you really want to make that impact and have a lot of nuance within the combat scenarios and the details of that, having some sort of map or miniature out that can help with those things makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think the one last thing that I want to mention is for maps and minis, you basically have two types of maps you can use: the hex maps or the square maps. Each is a little bit different. When it comes to the square map, I feel like it's a little bit more difficult than the hex maps if you're one of the traditional fireball type of range stuff. Like I think D&D probably lends itself a little bit better to the hexagonal maps, but I I don't see any harm in using square maps. There's everything's still going to be 5 feet and stuff like that.
Yeah. I, I, I don't know if I've actually ever played on a hexagonal map. I don't remember, but both of them work. Both of them get the job done. Doesn't really change the mechanics, but it does make the calculations, to your point, the calculations of how far away things are a little bit simpler when it's the hexagonal maps.
Yep. Um, and then I would say one last thing for the maps and minis. If you're going for that stuff, I would also say take a look at Pathfinder, Starfinder, some of those other tabletop games, as other games also have a lot of cool and interesting maps that you can definitely pull from. So both physically and virtually. And with that, I think definitely take a look, figure out what works for the right situation, and then go at it. And with that, I say keep your all's lives geeky, and until next time.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.